Chapter 1.9.1 Limit Ranges. Here's a short summary about the article. Limit ranges are policies in Kubernetes that enforce resource constraint rules for pods and persistent volume claims in a namespace. They set default and enforce specific requests and limits for compute and storage, ensuring fair resource allocation. Okay, that was the short summary. Let's have a deeper look into the contents. Limit ranges. By default, containers in a Kubernetes cluster have unrestricted access to compute resources. To manage this, administrators can implement Kubernetes resource quotas, which restrict the use of resources like CPU, memory, and persistent storage within a specific namespace. Pods can use resources up to the limits defined by these quotas. To prevent resource monopolization by a single object, Kubernetes uses limit ranges. These set constraints on resource allocations for objects such as pods and persistent volume claims. Limit ranges enforce minimum and maximum resource usage, dictate storage requests, and balance resource request limit ratios. They also apply default settings, influencing containers at runtime. The limit range operates per namespace when the object, named according to DNS subdomain rules, is present. Constraints on resource limits and requests. The administrator can define a limit range in a namespace, regulating default request and limit values for compute resources of objects like pods or persistent volume claims. This admission controller automatically applies default values to resources like CPU and memory when they aren't specified. It ensures that resource usage doesn't cross established boundaries such as minimum, maximum, and ratios. If resource requests or limits violate the constraints in the limit range, the API server denies the creation or update with a 403 forbidden error. Importantly, limit range appraisals only occur during the pod admission stage. Existing pods remain unaffected by limit range modifications, and if multiple limit ranges exist, the applied default value is unpredictable. Limit range and admission checks for pods. Limit range does not ensure that the default limits it applies are consistent with the resource requests made by containers. This can result in scenarios where a pod is unschedulable if the limit range's default limit is set lower than the requested resources. To avoid scheduling errors, explicitly setting both request and limit can help ensure compatibility. Code example. This code defines a limit range named CPU resource constraint that sets default limits and requests for the CPU resource. The limit range for the CPU is set between 100 meters and 1, with a default value of 500 meters. This restriction applies to containers within pods. This code defines a pod named example conflict with limit range CPU with a container named demo that requests 700 meters CPU resources. The pod will not be scheduled if the limit set by the limit range is less than the request value specified for the container. To avoid scheduling errors, it is recommended to set both request and limit values for resources in the pod specification. This error message is indicating that the CPU request value set for the container in the pod exceeds the CPU limit specified in the limit range, making the pod invalid and unable to be scheduled. To resolve this issue and allow the pod to be scheduled, the CPU request value should be adjusted to be less than or equal to the CPU limit specified in the limit range. This code defines a pod named example-noconflict-with-limit-range CPU with a single container named demo that uses the registry.kds.io/pos 2.0 image. The container specifies a CPU request and limit of 700 ms each, which ensures that the pod can be scheduled successfully even with any restrictions set by the limit range. Example resource constraints. In a two-node cluster setup, A limit range policy can manage resource usage by constraining pods within a namespace to specific CPU and memory requests and limits, such as 100-meter CPU request with a 500-meter max and 200-my memory request with a 600-my max. Default values can be set for containers without specified requests. Contention for resources may prevent pod creation, but existing resources remain unaffected.